Okay, so following on to our discussion of public opinion, what we're going to discuss in the second segment is how elites and interest groups work. So the basic dynamic is as follows. If elites are setting the agenda and publics are engaging in retrospective evaluation, how do publics communicate if elites are doing a good job or not? So it isn't the case that it's that stark and simplistic where policymaker initiates a policy and the public just evaluates it. What typically happens is it takes time for public, a sense for policies to manifest themselves. And prior to a policymaker initiating a policy, they try to get a feel for what support is for that policy, or how strong their support might be for that policy, or how much support they can gather from communities for that policy. And they have to get that information from somewhere. Where they get that information from are from elites and from special interest groups, which is interesting because most of the time when people, particularly Americans, think about special interest groups, they tend to think of something that is less, in a sense, less benevolent in their intentions, right? You tend to think of interest groups, or not necessarily you, but most people tend to think of interest groups as something that is distorting foreign policy or misshaping foreign policy or trying to change it from what it should be. Before you make that judgment, you have to ask yourself, what should it be, right? And I think when most people do make that judgment, when they say, what should it be, what they think it should be is what I agree with, right? Because my preferences should be the preference profile of the entire United States. Of course, that's not true, right? Of course, that's not necessarily how this works, because we know that Americans tend to have a lot of heterogeneity and tend to have different preferences. So one thing that special interest groups do is they try to communicate to different political leaders what mass publics want, or what a group of publics have agreed to that they think is valuable, right? So that's an information device. That certainly isn't to say that all special interest groups are completely benign. They do have some effects that might be looked at as deleterious. They do have some effects where they can cement different policies in place, and so you can make your judgment on that. Again, the point of this is to really see how foreign policy is actually working, how it's translating, how is it that the American foreign policy establishment works, versus make any sort of moral judgment on what they're doing. That you should do after, right? That once you have a good understanding of how this works, then you absolutely should be thinking about, is this good? Is this the right way to do things? Is there a better way to do things? But before we get there, we have to just see how this actually is working. So what we want to do today is or we want to do in this segment, is to think about how elites and interest groups work to influence foreign policy in the United States. And we want to think about a few issues where they look like they are particularly influential, and think about how they're influential, and also think about some of the controversies that are associated with that. So with that discussion, let me pull up the lecture. Okay, so the key themes we want to think about in this block are related to, again, elites and interest groups. We want to think about how do they affect foreign policy. We want to think about, are their effects positive or negative? Again, I think the better way to think about that is, what are some of their positive externalities? What are some of their negative externalities? Think about these things, I think, in a more complex way, in more terms of trade-offs versus good, bad, right? Now, and then the third one we want to think about is it the case that if we were to look at the American public and think that there is some collective interest, do interest groups take governments away from representing what are the true interests of, or what are the more representative interests of the American public? Now, one way to think about that is to go back to the data that were presented yesterday, which indicated that there is a gap between elite attitudes and the attitudes of the mass public. One possibility for that is that the elites are more informed, and the mass public just isn't paying attention, just doesn't care, will follow elite cues, and we know that that does happen, right? The other alternative explanation is that elites are somehow pulling Americans along by shaping the agenda and taking them away from policies they might otherwise support, right? So we want to think about that as we go through this particular talk. Okay, so again, several popular ideas about interest groups. One, that they distort public policy, right? That they compel the United States, U.S. policy to be terribly inefficient, to choose things that most of the public are against, and that they distort policy. A second idea about interest groups is that they tend to focus on policies that are relatively narrow and limited in scope, right? So they focus on things that benefit them at the expense of the American people as a whole. So one set of industries that have been criticized in this way are the oil and gas industries, where they've tried to pressure the U.S. government to continue to support drilling, to continue to support oil as a central part of the American energy infrastructure, versus moving towards other cleaner energies like solar and wind, etc. One could argue that that's distorting public policy and that's moving the United States towards an agenda that might not be best for the entire country. But again, what is best for the entire country is really not very clear, right? The oil and gas industry is a big contributor to the US economy. Many people are tied, rightly or wrongly, into that industry. And even if they're not, the work of the oil and gas industry does have consequences for nearly every sector in the United States. If the price of oil goes up, you can bet the price of food is going to go up, and the price of medicines are going to go up, and the price of electricity is going to go up. So in that sense, these industries are actually quite influential to the American public at large and the American economy at large. And if that's the case, they're not simply proposing policies that are distorting the U.S. economy in their favor. They're proposing policies that might be benefiting the U.S. economy as well. So both ideas may be true, right? But the popular view is that the oil and gas industry and interest groups like them are basically pulling away from the collective good, right? Or pulling policy away from the collective good, and therefore they're seen as a negative for foreign policy. So let's take a step back and think, are there any goods and special interests? Again, remember, what I'm encouraging you to do is to not think about the world in terms of good and bad. Think about the world in terms of trade-offs. If it's true that interest groups may have these distorted, deleterious effects, do they do any good too? And they probably do, otherwise they wouldn't be there, right? So one argument for pluralism is that interest groups fight in the public arena for scarce government resources. Now, take a step back. As an individual, you probably want many, many things for your government to do. I know I do, right? And you probably want the public to adopt particular policies. I know I do. I'm not going to tell you what those are, but I know I do, right? And if you have these beliefs, if you have these interests, if you want the public to adopt a policy that you believe is right and you believe is beneficial, right? As an individual, you have very little influence over public policy. You can vote, right? You can campaign, you can lobby, you can do these things, but as an individual, you don't have that influence. You're one person, right? But if you're able to mobilize into a group, then you're something more, right? Then suddenly you have this collective identity. Then if you're a politician, you're much more likely to pay attention to 100 people protesting versus just one person protesting. You're much more likely to read a letter that's signed by 500 people in the community versus one that's just penned by just one, or one that's submitted by one individual. And if you do that, then you as an individual are starting to gain power, but you can only do that by mobilizing into collective action and mobilizing into a group that can influence and get the attention of your policymaker. Regardless of what you're doing, and regardless of how benign you think that is, and regardless of how righteous you think that your cause is, and you have every right to think that, that's an interest group. An individual only gains this influence by trying to mobilize into a collective to try to get the attention of policymakers. As an example of this, think about labor unions, right? Individual laborers don't have a considerable amount of power, right? If one of them refuses to do a job, they can be replaced. But if all of them refuse to do a job, then that individual has gained quite a bit of power, right? That's the idea of mobilizing as a collective. That's the idea of producing collective action. And special interest groups are the manifestation of collective action. They come in wide varieties of forms, right? They come in causes that you may think are good. They come in causes that you may think are bad. What they are individuals in the United States that have particular preferences, and all of them believe in the righteousness of their cause, trying to mobilize to try to get the attention of governments, to try to compel governments to try to do something for them or try to represent their views in foreign policy in terms of public policy. So what they're doing for the politicians, which is useful, is cutting the cost of information. It's very difficult for politicians to get information about what every single individual wants. And what we also know is that the views of every individual tend to have a lot of heterogeneity. They tend to be diverse. They don't necessarily fit into neat boxes, right? It's difficult to get information for what individuals want. That's a problem for representation. If policymakers want to represent their constituents but have trouble understanding what their constituents want, how do they do this, right? Well, one thing that interest groups can do is to cut the cost to policymakers for getting this information. If interest groups can signal that a significant portion of the community favors a lack of environmental protection, or a significant group of the community favors more environmental regulation, telling a policymaker something. And a policymaker can then spend more time legislating, more time trying to enact that policy versus trying to figure out what it is their constituents actually want. So one advantage of having these special interest groups there, despite the normal negative connotation associated with these groups, is they're actually making it easier for politicians to understand in a broad stroke what it is their constituents actually want. It's cutting the cost of information for these politicians. Now, what they can, since by cutting the cost of information, right, what it can do is to help the politicians figure out what a public might actually want to do, right? If a politician were to set the agenda and present two alternatives to a public, what would the public choose? If it were to revise the agenda, set two sets of alternatives, what would it do? Now, remember, not all politicians get to set the agenda in that way. Presidents set the foreign policy agenda, right? Congressional leaders, senior congressional leaders may have that power, but most politicians just don't have that power, right? The agenda is being set. So they have to figure out what it is that their constituents actually want, how their constituents feel about these issues. And the way they can do that is by listening to interest groups. Because interest groups are providing a source of information that tell politicians how best to represent their constituents. Again, that sounds bad, right? It sounds like politicians are listening to interest groups, but think about the actual difficulty of trying to figure out what would every individual in the constituency want. That might be possible maybe in some smaller geographic concentrations of population, but in very large concentrations of population, it's very difficult to figure out what everybody wants. And if a politician is capable of having those information costs cut, then they can spend more time trying to craft legislation that better represents the interests that their constituents are trying to push forward, right? So this is a way for politicians to actually, in a sense, better do their jobs. It's hard to think of it that way, but that is one function of interest groups. Now, one of the negative sides of that is that if politicians are getting their information from interest groups can entrench policy. Interest groups can basically lock into policy. If they're the voice that politicians are listening to, it's going to be hard for that voice not to crowd out other voices, and it's going to be hard for that voice not to, in a sense, get what it wants. If that voice is paving the way for politicians to achieve re-election. So one of the most visible signs of interest group influence is something called an iron triangle. An iron triangle consists of three blocks. One, it consists of an interest group or a set of interest groups. It also consists of a government bureaucracy, and it also consists of a congressional committee. The way it works is the interest groups lobby the congressional committee for some policy. The congressional committee then appropriates the money for that particular policy. In order to enact that policy, it's then given into the hands of the bureaucracy. Government bureaucracies don't have all the capability to implement all policies, so they then typically have to contract back out to the private sector, which are typically industries that are contributing to these interest groups. So what you can see is that this creates a very a sustaining system where everybody is benefiting, right? The interest groups are benefiting from private sector donations. The interest group then lobbies the congressional committee. The congressional committee then sends the money to the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy then sends that money back to those same groups that are same firms that are participating in the interest groups activity. And you can see that there is a direct incentive for firms to participate in these interest groups in order to shape the agenda in their favor. That's your iron triangle, and that's something that's universally seen as something that can be distortive in American foreign policy. Again, so here's the process. A government bureaucracy is given the task of implementing some policy. They can't do that, right? They typically don't have the staff to do that. And the way government bureaucracies typically work is they have to try to contract out, or at least part of their functions they have to contract out. And just as an example of that, the Pentagon doesn't build its own weapons. It's in charge of procuring weapons, but it doesn't build its own weapons. It's told to build a certain number of fighter jets. The Pentagon can't do that, so it has to contract out to defense firms, right? Within those defense firms, there are particular ones that build these weapons that the defense industry is going to go to, but then these firms will turn around, take that money that they're getting from the Pentagon and start to lobby Congress to try to increase the number of planes or ships or submarines or whatever it is that they're trying to build. And so that money then gets cycled back. And, and since that creates this dynamic where there's always a demand for whatever it is that these firms are trying to build. So that's your process of an iron triangle. So the result of this ends up being something like, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine, right? If you are a congressional leader and your constituents, maybe from General Dynamics, tell you that it's really important for the U.S. defense posture to have many, many, many more submarines in the Pacific and many more expensive submarines like the Seawolf in the Pacific. If they're willing to tell you that and they're willing to support your reelection campaign, if you represent that view, you're more likely to go to that congressional committee and lobby for more funding for submarines, right, and more funding for a significant fleet in the Pacific. That will then, the task of them procuring that fleet will then be sent down to the DoD. DoD will then respond to General Dynamics, send the money to them. General Dynamics will then send the money back to the Congressional Committee to continue to lobby for more submarines. So what we end up getting is a system where more submarines are created regardless of whether or not you need them, in a sense, right? That whether or not you need them is not relevant, right? Whether or not you need them is a function of the economic interests of whoever's pushing this policy, at least in the case of Pentagon procurement, right? So what we then see is this ends up being a good trading relationship, because if this politician represents the interests of General Dynamics, if General Dynamics is getting rewarded with government contracts, General Dynamics will have quite a bit to get to this politician to keep them in power in their district. That's the essence of your iron triangle. Now, how does this actually work? Well, you can kind of say, how does this actually translate into whether or not politicians listen? Based on that iron triangle, you can see a clear incentive for politicians to listen, right? That these groups can help mobilize support for them if they're willing to listen to the needs of their constituents. Now, that might seem bad in the case of defense contractors or others, but it can be useful, right? If particular interest groups can get influence, right? If they can get a politician to listen and promise that they'll mobilize for them, and promise that they'll fight for them, and promise that they'll give them support, that politician should listen to them. And more importantly, if those interests can say that if you don't do what we ask you to do, we'll vote against you, right? Then that politician's also more likely to listen. So one way to look at it is the iron triangle relationship, where it looks corrupt. Even though it's all legal, it looks corrupt. The other way to look at it is this is how interest groups actually get things done, right? This is how a collective group of people can actually get things done, right? If they have particular interests, regardless of what they are, that's how they can get a congressional representative to listen, right? So what interest groups can do is they can provide these rewards, right? They can get involved in iron triangles and try to reward politicians this way. If there is no iron triangle, there's no congressional committee to reward them or anything like that. If they're more ideological, what they can do is threaten potential retribution. What they can do is tell politicians, look, if you don't represent our votes, if you don't represent our interests, we will either not turn out or we will vote for the other side, right? So if politician X votes against abortion, as an example, interest group Y won't vote for them, right? That threat is not always credible, though, right? That threat to punish a politician may not always be credible. So I'll make an example as to why. Let's look at this particular model. Let's assume that this continuum represents a set of policies. And let's assume that these policies right here are more pro-Israel. These policies right here are more pro-Palestinian. And let's assume that we have this interest group called the Council of American Islamic Relations that will try to push for policies that are more pro-Palestinian as opposed to being pro-Israel. Now, if we look at the distribution of the candidates in this particular election cycle, Trump is likely to favor more policies that are pro-Israel. From Biden's perspective, Biden's also more pro-Israel than Biden is pro-Palestinian. That's pretty consistent in the American political discourse. But Biden may be more willing to sanction Israel, not economically sanctions, but more likely to rebuke Israel for some of their activities as opposed to Trump. So based on that, it looks like the Council for American Islamic Relations should prefer Biden to Trump, right? They should prefer Biden because Biden's more likely to adopt policies that are closer to CAIR's ideal point as opposed to Trump. But here's the problem. Even if Biden adopts policies that CAIR doesn't like, they can't jump to Trump, right? Because Trump is even further away from their ideological ideal point as opposed to Biden. So in a sense, they're tied to Biden that way, or whoever is left of Trump, they're tied to whoever that may be. Whereas if Biden loses and Trump wins, CAIR is going to be worse off. So CAIR, in trying to influence Biden, can't say, if you don't do what we want, we're going to turn around and support the other person. That's just not likely to work. And because Biden knows that, in a sense, it looks like CAIR's interests cannot be filtered through Biden. Biden has no incentive to listen to them, right? They have to basically do whatever Biden wants. But what they can do, credibly, is threaten to not vote. What they can do is tell Biden that, look, if you don't do what we want, or at least try to represent some of what we want, we won't turn out. And then since more of the election is going to tilt towards Trump versus Biden. So that's one way that these interest groups can use the threat of mobilization to try to get what they want in foreign policy. They can't necessarily threaten to flip to the other side given their ideological preferences. But what they can do is say, if you don't do what we want, our voters won't be enthusiastic, they're less likely to turn up, and they care about this issue and this issue only, right? So this is the key issue. If you don't do what we want on this particular issue dimension, we just won't turn out at all. You're going to be worse off, and you're more likely to lose your reelection prospects, right? And we'll be worse off as a result of that, but our voters will lose their enthusiasm, right? So that's one way to try, in order to preempt that, Biden might try to move towards CAIR's position to ensure that CAIR's membership continues to turn out in the election. You can make the same argument for any other interest group, that what they can't do necessarily is threaten to flip sides, but what they might be able to do is to threaten not to vote at all. Now, there are some interest groups that actually play this both ways. There are some interest groups that provide resources to both campaigns, to both Republicans and Democrats. What they can do, if one politician doesn't represent their interests, is starting to pull funding for them, and therefore all their funding will shift to one politician, and that politician will benefit at the expense of the one that defied them. So that's another way interest groups can use the threat of mobilization to try to accomplish what they want. So given that, they can participate in iron triangles, given that they can threaten politicians with not showing up, you can ask yourself the question, are they distorting foreign policy? We know politicians are getting their information about what the public wants through special interests. So maybe they are, right? Maybe they actually are. Maybe they're completely distorting what it is that the public wants. Maybe they're telling politicians the public wants X when public opinion data suggests that the public doesn't really want that, right? Or is not as interested in that. But here's the issue. Without these special interests, how would individuals get any access to the process? They wouldn't. There's no way that all individuals can communicate what they want in an intelligible way to politicians unless it's filtered in some way. Think about the variety of opinions that you might have on what the U.S. should do in Afghanistan. How would you make sense of all of that if you're a politician? What you have to be able to do is to group people into bins, so you have some idea of what people generally want, and then you can make sense on what they want to do. Right, but what you can't do is to listen to everybody's intricate opinion on Afghanistan and try to incorporate that and try to make policy out of that. There's too much heterogeneity. There's too much variation there. So it has to be grouped up and has to be communicated in a way to understand, okay, which group actually has the most influence? What is the majority? Because everybody's going to tell you that they are the majority, right? But what you have to be able to do is to figure out a way to judge who actually is the majority. So special interests provide that function. They allow for individuals to actually contribute to a process, signal to politicians what they want, albeit in a more collective way, but they allow for individuals not to be shut out of the process completely, right? So are they somewhat distorting foreign policy? They shift what the mean, in a sense, what politicians might see, but they also allow individuals to get some influence over the foreign policy process, whereas they wouldn't have one. An alternative way of looking at this that one of my first instructors of political science taught me, his name is John Kingdon at the University of Michigan, is he basically said, really, if you want to look at it, all of us are special interests. We all want something that is represented by a special interest, right? If you want gun control, there's a special interest group for that. If you're not pro-gun control, there's a special interest for that. If you are pro-Israel, there's a special interest for that. If you are not pro-Israel, there's a special interest for that. If you are pro-nuclear proliferation, there's likely a special interest group for that. If you are pro-curbing nuclear proliferation, there's certainly a special interest group for that. So we are all special interests. That's just how our interests are communicated to incumbent politicians that are trying to figure out what to do and trying to figure out what is it that we want. It's communicated through special interests. So whose interests actually get represented in a more significant way? Well, in the United States, this isn't true in all electoral systems, but in the United States has this funny system called the Electoral College, where each state has an election when it comes to the executive. Those elections select electors. The electors then tend to vote for what the majority in their state voted for, unless they have a different system. So what that means is that if you are an incumbent president and you're in charge of making these foreign policy decisions, you're going to focus on particular states that are going to be valuable to your retention. You don't necessarily have to focus on the collective whole. What you would focus on are the particular groups of people that will be useful. Now, foreign policy is a public good, right? It's not the case that you can divorce defense policy and what's good for someone in Wisconsin from what's good for someone in Illinois, or what's good for someone in Nevada, or good for someone in Maine. So most of the things that presidents are going to do are public goods. And so they have an incentive to represent all Americans that way. But it's true that with special interests, it might make more sense to pay attention to special interest groups in Pennsylvania. It might make more sense to pay attention to special interest groups in Wisconsin, right, or in Arizona, because those are where your swing states are. And so if you want to look at how you're going to maximize your chance of staying in power, the special interest groups you have to listen to tend to be those that are in the swing states. One example of this is American foreign policy towards Cuba, which was traditionally thought of as being heavily influenced by the Cuban population in Florida. At some point, you have to ask yourself, does everyone in the Cuban population vote the same, right? Is this just a stereotype? Is this just a myth? But if you're a politician, why take a chance? But you know that there's a significant number of anti-Castro Floridians, anti-Castro Cubans in Florida. You know that Florida is a crucial electoral state. So why take a chance? Why try to deviate from an anti-Castro position? So I think that's how presidents would look at this, is when you think about whose interests get represented, you want to look at the states that are going to be critical towards your attention and focus on those, right? If you are the Senate majority leader and you want to keep the Senate, you look at the states that are in play, you focus on those. If you're representing a particular district, you focus on your constituents. But the key thing is who's going to influence your chance of being retained, right? Once you identify those individuals, those are the groups that you want to pay more attention to, right? Or at least those are the groups empirically that politicians do pay more attention to. So next question you can ask yourself is, how much influence do these special interest groups actually have over the foreign policy process? Now, again, if you read Foreign Affairs, you read The Economist, or any of these other foreign policy journals, some would argue that the entire U.S. foreign policy establishment is dominated by special interests. Maybe, right? Again, that's how individuals represent their voices to politicians, but it also may pull politicians and give politicians a skewed view of what the public wants and what the public will respond to, right? Now, if you take it a step further, this is often looked at by some authors of American foreign policy as something exists called a military industrial complex, where there's a group of foreign policy interest groups that lobby for military spending, which then is spent, right, and then filters back to these interest groups and their representatives, and the cycle repeats itself, much in the way that an iron triangle repeats itself. That's been looked at by some authors like Noam Chomsky, who would argue that explains unending wars from the United States. Now, when I say unending wars from the United States, I mean unending military actions. And it's true that since 1945, the United States has been involved in numerous military action. If it's the case that you are a weapons manufacturer and you need to manufacture demand for bullets, right, you can sell the US government bullets, but at some point they're going to have too many bullets unless they use them, right? And so there may be an incentive on the part of some of these interest groups to try to push the US government into using their bullets and to initiating conflicts or participating in conflicts so that you can continue to resupply bullets, right? So that's an example of what Chomsky's talking about. And so his argument is that if you look at operations like Afghanistan, like the no-fly zone in Iraq, those were ways for defense contractors to try to extend demand for their products so that the US government continues to do that, right? Now, that's a similar argument being made by other authors like Gore Vidal, who would argue that the US is almost completely dominated by business interests, right? Business interests dominate what the US government is doing. Another group that seems to have considerable influence over the United States, according to some authors, is what's called the Israel lobby, right? This is an argument that was made, it's very controversial, that was made by Mearsheimer and Walt, which suggested that this interest group known as AIPAC, which is incredibly influential in DC circles, has an undue influence over US foreign policy. Another way to look at it in terms of US foreign policy is not just AIPAC, it's also these numerous think tanks that are in the DC area that tend to be funded by Gulf states, right? So the argument there is that American foreign policy is heavily influenced by the spending of the Saudis and other Gulf states on these think tanks, which then inform policymakers, which then lead policymakers to adopt policies that are more pro-Saudi Arabia as opposed to pro-Iran. And the Israel lobby continues to push the United States to adopt policies that are pro-Israel versus pro-Palestinian, or deviate from that idea that Israel is a critical part of the U.S. security picture. Now, the alternative explanation is that Israel may well be something that the support of Israel may well be something that many Americans want. There seems to be quite a bit of evidence of that in opinion data, and it may well be the case that Americans prefer working with the Saudis to working with the Iranians, and that these interest groups are simple manifestations of that. That's the alternative explanation. The explanation being presented by some of these authors is that the groups themselves are divorced from what the public actually wants and are starting to tell the public what to think and set the agenda for the public, such that the groups themselves have much more influence over what the United States is doing in terms of foreign policy. So let's examine this issue. Let's think about how this would work, right? If we look at this, we can point to AIPAC as an example of why the United States supports Israel, right? One argument for why the United States is so pro-Israel, right, if we believe that, is because AIPAC would punish a politician if they were not pro-Israel, right? If they suddenly start to punish Israel, if they sanctioned Israel, if they demanded Israel stop settlements, if they allowed Israel to be condemned in the UN, then they would be punished by AIPAC, right? However, let's think about some other important influence over American foreign policy. These same authors often argue that AIPAC is a big influencer, but so is the American oil and gas industry. Would they support Israel? The answer is not really, right? Because most of their interests would be in alignment with many of the Gulf states who are not necessarily pro-Israel. Why shouldn't the oil and gas industry argue that the United States should be anti-Israel? It's interesting that when we look at the recognition of Israel that happened in the 1940s with the Truman administration, The oil and gas industry was opposed to that, right? The oil and gas industry was concerned that by recognizing Israel, you would compromise their ties to Iran, right? It would alienate Iran along with some of the other Gulf states. So why would they be pro-Israel when their interests lie more with states that are anti-Israel, right? And what about defense contractors? Right, defense contractors might be more interested in providing weapons to Israel's competitors, right? Israel is an important market. Israel, you can provide quite a bit of defense equipment to Israel, but there's also a market out there from the Arab states, right, and from some of Israel's competitors that why wouldn't you want to sell to them too, right? And so why should the United States close itself off from those markets, especially given that if it did, those markets would be absorbed by the Russians or by some other defense contractor or by the French or something else, right? Therefore, if you dissect this, right, APEC is one point of entry. APEC is something that seems to influence U.S. foreign policy, but we see that there's other points in the U.S. foreign policy machine that these authors often view as similarly influential that may lobby for something else, right, that might not necessarily be as pro-Israel. Therefore, can you really argue, right, if you're going to make the case that the oil and gas industry is influential and defense contractors are influential, how can U.S. behavior be strictly a function of what APEC wants? And the answer is it probably can't, right? Probably that these interests of the oil and gas industry and defense contractors, their interests have to be represented as well, right? So what we can think about is that given particular issues, how strong is the support of these different interest groups? And given these competing lobbies, how do politicians respond? When presented with a crisis in the Middle East, for example, that involves Israel and maybe one of its neighbors, certainly APEC is going to lobby the United States to, or whoever's in charge, whoever's the president, to support Israel. But maybe some of these other firms in the oil and gas industry might say, well, don't be so pro-Israel, right? Make sure that you at least acknowledge the concerns of some of these other states. So it's not clear necessarily what the direct influence is from a special interest group to foreign policy. There's some, I think. I don't think you would argue that Israel is completely distorting U.S. policy, right? Especially because a significant portion of the U.S. foreign policy establishment remains committed to the Oslo Peace Accord. The Trump administration has recently put forth peace proposals that effectively dismantled the Oslo Peace Accord, and there is support for that. But there's a significant portion of the American foreign policy establishment that still remains committed to Oslo, which is not necessarily something that all Israelis would favor, or certainly that Benjamin Netanyahu would favor. Right? You probably also wouldn't argue that oil interests completely dominate U.S. foreign policy because the U.S. is still committed to Israel. Rightly or wrongly, the U.S. is still committed to Israel, right? And it could be the case that Gulf nations have long asked the United States, you need to be less pro-Israel. And they have. And it can be the case that Gulf nations have long asked the United States, you need to at least represent the interests and the views of the Palestinians in these peace negotiations. The U.S. has done that, but the U.S. has also remained committed to the security of Israel, right? So you couldn't argue that oil interests have completely dominated the U.S. foreign policy establishment because the U.S. is still committed to Israel. So if we look at this, what we're seeing in the U.S. foreign policy viewpoint, right, given that there's a competition amongst these special interest groups, looks like a product of bargaining. The U.S. is doing both. It is supporting Israel while at the same time supporting its oil industry, right? It's doing both. It's not necessarily a coherent strategy. It doesn't have to be, right? It's not necessarily something that makes complete sense. It's not something that's completely consistent. If you think of this as not just this monolithic unitary actor that is the United States that makes decisions based on a complete intransitive preference profile, and think of it instead as a group of individuals that are trying to maintain office, that are trying to stay in power and have to listen to the viewpoints of a whole bunch of different constituents that are aggregated into interest groups, they're trying to represent everybody to the extent that they can. So sometimes they may engage in policies that look like they're contradictory. That's pretty normal, right? That's pretty normal. Sometimes you make compromises. Sometimes you say, I'll do this policy for you. I'll do another policy for you, right? In order to compensate. So what you could argue that U.S. policy, U.S. foreign policy is when it comes to interest groups is basically a bargain of all these different interest groups. If that bargain is there, and if that bargain is maintained by the threat that these interest groups have to pull support, not necessarily switch support, but to pull support, What we might expect is that we see a pretty predictable and somewhat stable set of preferences in both Congress and the executive. Let me say that again. If it's true that these interest groups remain fairly consistent, their preferences have been voiced, and that foreign policy is basically a way to try to placate all of them, right? To try to give all of them what they want to the extent that's possible. What you might expect is that US foreign policy is pretty stable, right? And pretty predictable, given the distribution of preferences in the Congress and the executive. Now, it can be the case again, but we saw that if Congress and the executive line up in terms of their preferences and want to radically change things, they can. But for the most part, they don't, right? For the most part, policy in the United States seems to remain fairly stable, right? Again, there's some issues where it can shift rapidly, but for the most part, if we look at the last 75 years, US policy has been somewhat predictable and somewhat stable, and that can be partially explained by this configuration of interest groups that politicians are all trying to please, even though they have competing preferences. Now, again, we can look at some examples of this. Like, for example, this is a map of the price of oil during particular conflicts. So we can see that the price of oil increases during particular conflicts and particular points. That's often used as an explanation that oil interests benefit from war. That's not entirely true, right? Oil interests, the price of oil goes up, but also if the price of oil is going up, demand may also go down, right? So it's not necessarily the case that the price of oil, in the sense that these industries always benefit, because sometimes the price of oil is offset by trying to deal with some of the risks associated with these wars. What we can say, I think, fairly definitively, is that the US government has a very clear interest in making sure that oil can be extracted and sold on the open market, and that the US government is absolutely committed to making sure that there's a free flow of energy in the world, right? That energy from the Middle East is able to be made into market, makes it sold to market, and that the supply of oil is not disrupted, right? And so I think we can say that that's a better representation of how the oil industry's interests are represented by the United States versus just the price of oil. Price of oil is significant, but what's more important is, are there customers, right? Is oil able to make it to market? Are oil industries able to sell their product? Are they able to sell their product uninterrupted, right? Are they able to sell their product even when something like the Arab Spring is going on, or the Iraq War is going on, or the tanker war of the 1980s is going on? So let's think about the overall interest of interest groups then. What we can say is that interest groups do look like they have some influence over foreign policy, particularly in swing states. We can also see that interest groups do have influence over US defense policy in terms of iron triangles. Certainly that's the case. But it's a stretch, I think, to say that interest groups completely dictate the course of US foreign policy, because oftentimes very powerful interest groups compete with each other, which may lead US policy to look weird, right? It may look at US foreign policy to look idiosyncratic, right? Or it may allow US foreign policy to seem like it's one hand's not talking to the other. This is, if you stop thinking about the US as a unitary actor that has a collective set of preferences and start thinking about this as a collection of individuals, and start thinking about this as an individual that's trying to make sure that they get reelected and trying to appease these different interests, and that these different interest groups are representations of what people want, then you can kind of understand some of the incoherence here, right? It's also the case that for every interest group, there's typically one that opposes it. If that's the case, this often leads to this interesting set of stability within the United States, where you know where your bread is buttered, you know who's working for you, you know who's on your side, you know who's likely to pull their support and who's not likely to pull their support. So US policy is actually going to look fairly stable, even though there are some periods where it can radically shift. For the most part, given the configuration of interest groups, US foreign policy is going to be fairly stable, and it has been for the last 75 years, right? The outcome of this is a product of bargaining. It's been this product of bargaining. It's been consistently this product of bargaining. Given that the bargain is efficient, it's not likely to radically change. So when we think about interest groups, again, the way we want to conceptualize them, I think, is that interest groups are ways that, since interest groups are ways that public opinion can be translated into signaling to elites what the public is actually interested in, right? This is a way for individuals to try to communicate what they want to leaders, And so, although it might seem like it's distorting things, another way to look at it is that the US government's basically trying to appease as many people as possible in its constituency in order to try to maximize its chance of reelection. I think that actually is a better representation of what interest groups are actually doing. Okay, so I will stop there for today. Be sure to contribute to the discussion board if you can today, if you get a chance, and if you're so interested. And also, I am trying to, I sent you an email link. I'm going to set up a Zoom meeting for tomorrow for my office hours. Um, Hopefully it works. I've had some weird trouble with Zoom in the past, so I do apologize for that. But I am planning on just having that Zoom meeting there for office hours. What I'll do is I will allow for a waiting room, so that should keep some people out, so I can talk with you one-on-one if you're interested. But if you are planning on attending that, I still think it's a good idea for you to email, just so I can make sure that I'm there and available and waiting for you when you're willing to come. So thank you for paying attention today, and I will look forward to continuing to deliver these lectures to you. And please pay attention to the syllabus for upcoming due dates.